Wakaronga ki te tangi a tema tuia. Tuia i runga, tuia i raro, tuia i roto, tuia i waho. Tuia e te here tangata, kāronga te pō, kāronga te ao. Tuia i te muka tangata i takia mai i Hawaii ki nui, Hawaii ki roa, Hawaii ki pāma mao. Te hono ki te wairua, ki te waio, ki te ao, marama, tihei, mauri ora. Hei mua koe i a mātou e ihoa. Hei to'u i a mātou mahi katoa, ko koe anu hoki a wakakaha i a mātou, kia waikarori ai koe i a mātou mahi katoa. He mea timata, he mea mahi, he mea waka oti o roto i a koe, kia wiwhi hai tonu ki te ora tonu, nā te mea te whai tia mai nei koe, ko ihu karaiti ko tō tātou āriki, rere hau, pai mārere. Ki te atua rongarawa, ko te matua te kore, ko te tama i roro kutia, me te wairua tapu, ko te tokotoru tapu, tēnei te mihi, tēnei te mihi, tēnei te mihi. Kia maunga Taranaki, e koro. Ka nui te mihi kia koe, mo he wiki wakahirehira, mō tō tātou hoki ki tō tātou tupuna o Taranaki maunga, tēnei te mihi. Kia rātou mā kua wihi atu ki te pō o tēnei wiki, haere oki atu rā ki te hānea o tō tātou tupuna, me te poho o tō tātou papa i o matua te kore. Huri atu ki te pō, huri mai ki te ao. Ki te wenua e karapotia, mihi mai, te whenua o Ngāti Tuwiti hapu. Nō reira e a Ngāti Tuwiti ka nui te mihi kia koutou mo te pō nei. Ki te whānau o Meri Tapu, tēnā tātou mo tō manaki o tēnei pō mo tēnei wānanga, tēnā koutou. Mea nā rauranga tira mā, mea nā hāpori māo, nā motu, nau mai ki te wari hononga, nau mai ki te wari wānanga, ki te wari mo te hauhau i te rongo. Nō reira, ha tēnā koutou, huri no tēnā tātou katoa. G'day mates. Hang on, you right? Awesome, welcome everybody to Wari Hononga, a place to embrace hau i te rongo, reconciliation. But before I get my preach on, let me hand it to my brother from another mother, the Reverend Dan Lander.
Kia ora koutou, kia tau taranga maria, kia koutou katoa, peace be with you all. If you weren't here last week, my name is Dan, and I am a priest here at the Taranaki Cathedral. And as I said to the folk last week, I have the super exciting job of doing health and safety. Super rad. So I'm just going to read this out. That way I won't miss anything, and that way it'll be on you if you get stuck. Just jokes. If you see a fire or an emergency, please notify one of the cathedral staff or one of our cathedral whānau. If you're from the cathedral, could you just pop your hand up quickly? Grab one of those people. They will help you out. In the event of a fire, an alarm will sound and the wardens in their high-vis vests will guide you. The exits are out this main door here. And we've also got an exit out through this one as well. There's another door and it just takes you round to the back. So please make your way out of those doors in a orderly fashion. And our assembly point is just up the back there, behind the vicarage and behind the car park on the grass lawn out there. But yeah, just keep an eye out for the person in the high-vis vest. They will guide you and let you know where to go. If you're looking for a toilet, toilets are just through in the vicarage, which is that big building just there. They're just sort of in the back corner. We've got some hosts in there, Jen and Don, so if you're looking for the bathrooms, make your way over there and someone will be able to point you in the right direction. Just a couple of other quick notices as well before we get into it. Tonight's event is a koha event. If you'd like to make a koha, you can either do that by scanning this QR code, and that will take you through to a site where you can do that. Or we've got cash and FPOS up the back in the corner there. Go and see Will or Chris, and they will help you out. We've also got Jay's book, Huia Come Home, for sale tonight as well. So if you'd like to grab a copy of that, Jay will speak more about that book, but we do have some of those for sale as well. And if you miss out tonight, just head down to Poppy's. They have them there as well. I think that's about us. Over to you, bro.
Cool. Tēnā tātou. Awesome to have everyone here tonight. Just want to thank everyone who was here last week for an amazing atmosphere. And I know we had people who knew some of what we said, what was shared last week. Many didn't, and some came here with an alternative opinion as well, which some of you may have come as well tonight. But I just want to thank everyone that no matter what all of our opinions were, just take my hat off to everybody for participating in a really, really wonderful wānanga and a wonderful evening. And everyone was wonderfully behaved on such an interesting topic. And upon that topic, I have created something for you all this week. In our cathedral in 1972, a carving was put up, and that carving was called Kia aroha koutou tētehi ki tētehi, which is a quote from the Paipera Tapu, which is that you would love one another, based on the story of Taranaki and Te Atiawa coming together, and Takarangi and Te Raumahora. Now, on this document, what you will find are just a couple of principles about how to agree and how to disagree really, really well. And this is something that you can take to your own whānau, to your own workplace. There's just some principles in here about, okay, how do you do disagreement in a nice way, in a constructive way. So my hope in providing this is that it'll be a takeaway for you, that this is what our governance team around here are aligning ourselves to here at Meritapu. So I just wanted to give you that tonight. As well, at the end, I do have a booklet to give everybody at the end, which is of a speech I gave in 2019 at a conference, a Te Fund conference. But in it is a lot of the material I used last week with a lot of references. So people were asking over text last week about some of the references. Apologies that I wasn't able to answer those directly via social media. I was in Auckland Hospital this last week, just looking after my mum and my dad. But there are a lot of references in this that you can get at the end of the night, so the ushers will hand those out as you walk out. But as Dan has mentioned, this thing is referenced to the hilt. So a lot of what I say is also referenced well in this book here as well. Ka pai? Just a reminder tonight, of our tikanga. As we did last week, we're going to do the same. Questions are going to come via text, so that we're not going to stand up and ask for questions. The reason for this is so that you can articulate your question well and succinctly. Kei te pai? Secondly, as we showed last week, if you're feeling the old buzz in the old belly, and you're like, oh, that guy's talking a whole bunch of BS, and I'm going to throw something at him. Let me remind you, this is a house of reconciliation and a house of peace. And also, if someone feels like you really must stand up and talk, and you don't sit down when we ask you to sit down, I will ask everybody to stand. And I will say, parau ko tu ko. We will stand for a minute. And then after that minute, I will ask everyone if we're in agreement that we carry on. If we're not in agreement, then we will all walk out silently and get a hot chocolate or a coffee from the coffee cart. Kei te pai? Everyone agree to those terms? Ka pai. Choice. Well, I'm looking forward to this. Last night was all prep for tonight. Okay, so if you missed last week, there is a YouTube link where you can listen to it. There is a bit of poor sound quality at the start, but I think it comes right towards the end. We think we've sorted the sound out tonight. Last week. Of course, talking about Te Tiriti. Before we start, can we stand? I want us to sing Tu Tira Mai Ngā Iwi. And for those of you who don't know the translation, line up together, people, all of us, stand in rows, people, all of us, seek after knowledge and love of others, everyone. Think as one, act as one, all of us. All right? Go, Lacey, you lead us off. Oe! Tātou, tātou e, tu tira mai ngā iwi. Tātou, tātou e, whai a te maranatanga, me te aroha. E ngā iwi ki a patapatai, ki a patai rā. Tātou, tātou e, tātou. Tātou, tātou e. Ski au wahi. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. This song, Tu Tira, I like to use this one because this was a song written by this man, the Reverend Canon Huata. And he wrote it when he was on holiday with his whānau by Lake Tu Tira. And he wrote it because they were all piled into their car, and on the top of the hill, their car broke down. And his whānau all started to get all angry. And so on the spot, he wrote this song and called his whānau, say, hey, look, I know you've got different opinions because you want to get down to the lake and go for a swim. But this is what the song is about. In a state of things going badly, in a state of people beginning to argue that the car's broken down or whatever's broken down or the country's broken down or the treaty's broken down or whatever it is, tu tira mai ngā iwi. Ka pai? That's a little bit of history to that song. So last week we shared these maps. 20 years after the signing of Te Tiriti, after our chiefs signed a document that we could retain onto our lands, our possessions, our treasures, this is what remains 50 years down to 100 years after the signing of Te Tiriti. The South Island was all gone in 1860. And then, of course, the 2017 stat is the notion land holdings is 4.8% in Māori ownership. So if you want to know about where does the sadness and the antagonism of Te Tiriti come from, that's it in a nutshell, folks. That all of this whenua was gone after the Queen entered into agreement with the chiefs that we could retain our land and our leadership for as long as we wanted it to. Kei te pai. Now, what I'm going to share tonight is a little bit not what you've been taught for 51 years. In fact, it's not what you've been taught for 51 years. I've got a very differing opinion. And so you do not have to believe me. But I can point you to a jolly big book and a couple of Waitangi Tribunal treaty reports, which I'll give reference to later on, and you can do your research yourself. But it's not what is the common story when it comes to the conversation that there are two versions of the treaty. The Treaty of Waitangi in Te Reo Pākehā in English, and Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Māori version. What has been taught for 51 years is that those two versions are irreconcilable because of the language that is used in them. So I'm going to go through that story tonight, and I'm going to use different different sort of postings in history to validate what I'm going to say. Once again, if you go, oh, that guy's talking a whole bunch of BS, send Reverend Dan a text and ask for your question, okay? Who remembers this poster? Okay, from the 70s and 80s, the treaty is a fraud. It signifies a time where our people in the 70s were like, that's it. This covenant and this agreement has not been adhered to, and out of anger and our antagonism, is rightfully so, that our people rose up and began to protest. My problem with this poster in particular is that the notion that the treaty is a fraud was first mentioned by William Wakefield of the New Zealand Company. And he said, this pretend treaty is a fraud on the ignorant natives and a sham towards more intelligent people. Okay, so the first person to call the treaty a fraud was William Wakefield. Now, why? Because it was created to stop him from buying large chunks of land, aka from Golden Bay through to Kaikoura. All of Wellington. Okay, so when the treaty was signed by Hobson, the missionaries, and over 500 of our rangatira, it halted their ability to be able to take large chunks of land. Now, a little bit of a glossary before we get into the versions. First word I want to highlight today is the word called mana. Sorry if that's a little bit too small writing for you fellas back in the back there. The word mana means your prestige, your authority, control, power, influence, status, spiritual power, your charisma, your aura, the light around you. Your mana comes from your tupuna, from your ancestors passed down to you. Your mana comes from your exploits and the things that you do. Your mana comes from your ability to serve your community. Comes from your family. It's a highly prized possession. Okay, second word I want to point out when it comes to understanding Te Tiriti is ka wanatanga. Everyone say ka wanatanga. Ka pai. Ka wanatanga means government, dominion, rule, authority, governorship, or province. Final words I want to say is tino rangatiratanga. Ka pai. You know, when this house was being built, and there was scaffoldings around there on Waitangi Day, I climbed up the top and hung a tino rangatiratanga flag. Anyway, so it means your self-determination, means your sovereignty, domination, rule, power, control, autonomy. Now, the important thing you need to know about ka wanatanga and tino rangatiratanga is that in 1840, when our people read those words and used those words in a sort of in the way they were most commonly used at that time, the only place they had seen those words in use was in the Paipera Tapu, was in the Holy Bible. So in 1840, when our people read Te Tiriti, they were reading the language of the Bible. And therefore, in the fact that they were reading the language of the scriptures, our people understood Te Tiriti as a sacred covenant because it had the language of the sacred text. Our people today still hold to Te Tiriti as a covenant coming from the sacredness of those ancient Hebrew texts. The word kawanatanga was the word used in the Paipera in the Gospels to describe the governor of Judea. The words tino, which means your absolute or your very, rangatiratanga, was the term that was used to describe the kingdom of God. Te tino rangatiratanga o te atua. Dr. Roger Marker writes this: although originally used in the 1835 Declaration of Independence by Māori chiefs and recognised by Britain, rangatiratanga appears to have limited usage except by 19th century missionaries who used it to convey the biblical notion of kingdom. Okay, so when our people began to read Te Tiriti o Waitangi, our people approached it with that lens. It wasn't just, it wasn't approached as a legal contract, like you might sign over for your house. It was approached as this is a sacred spiritual thing that our people are entering into with the Queen. Ka pai? Marama? Okay, let me introduce an amazing lady. Her name is Ruth Ross. Ruth Ross was an amazing academic at Auckland University. She was a linguist, studied languages. And in 1972, she was asked to present a paper to Victoria University in Wellington. And she stood up in 1972 and presented her paper, which had two profound effects in it. The first one was this, is that she said, you know what, people, we talk about the Treaty of Waitangi, but guess what? The Treaty of Waitangi was not signed. The signed document was Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So if we're going to talk about this thing, under the rules of international law, I'm referring to the one that was signed by the indigenous people, it is actually the Māori language that is actually the true version of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Now, she was the first one to say that in 1972. So if anyone wants to say anything about maybe what Sir Apirana Ngata might have thought of with his opinion back in his time, there's been well and truly new scholarship beyond him, and in a significant way, starting with this lady Ruth Ross, actually highlighting to the people that, look, it was actually the Māori version that's signed, so that's the one we should be talking about. The English one can say whatever it wants to say, it doesn't matter because it doesn't have the right preference. It's the Māori version. So when she stood up and said that, round of applause, ka pai, yeah, that's right. Oh, where? Second thing she did is this, is that she looked at the language of He Wakaputanga, which is the Declaration of Independence, that was signed and translated and signed in 1835. And she looked at the word sovereignty and then the Māori word here, and then she looked at the English in the treaty in 1840 and then the Māori translation of sovereignty there, and she was like, what's going on here? There are two different words. Here's what she pulled out. In 1972, she goes, in 1835, when it came to translating the notion of our chiefs standing up and declaring we have sovereignty over the islands of Aotearoa, Henry Williams, who was the lead missionary who translated He Wakaputanga from English into te reo, used the word mana. So in 1835, the word mana was used to go, we declare our mana over these islands. 5 years later, in the translation of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, Henry Williams, to translate the notion of sovereignty, used the word kawanatanga. And so she goes, hang on a sec here. What's going on? 5 years in 1835, but earlier, the word sovereign was used, the word mana was used. Now, what's your mana? Your spiritual authority, right? Your charisma, your ihi and your wehi, your declaration. In 1835, we were declaring our mana as our sovereignty over these islands. 5 years later, Henry Williams uses the word kāwanatanga. And she's like, hang on a sec, mana and kāwanatanga are two completely different words here. What's going on? Pause for dramatic effect. And she'll go, and here's what she's, in 1972, she stands up and says, I'll tell you what's going on. The language of the Treaty of Waitangi is not Indigenous Māori. It is missionary Māori, specifically Protestant missionary Māori. It was not the New Zealanders who called this unknown thing kāwanatanga. It was the Protestant missionaries. It is difficult to conclude that the omission of mana from the text of the Treaty of Waitangi was no accidental oversight. Is not this woolly-mindedness the real crux of the Waitangi problem? So here she was, right? Dame Whina Cooper, what does she do? 1971, big march, right? The start of the decade of the 70s, to which we call the Māori Renaissance, right? There's this uprising amongst our people that are looking over our history and going, enough is enough. We've had it, right? I think of Hana Te Hemara on our wall here. 50 years ago, putting a petition asking for Māori language to be taught in our schools. And that's still being fought for. But here was this generation who was standing up and saying, we have the Raglan Golf Course, we have Bastion Point, we have Ngā Tamatoa, like I said, we have the Haka Party incident, right? Who went to the play? It was amazing. So in the 70s is the period to which we call the Māori Renaissance. And at the start of that period, Ruth Ross delivers a powerful address that points blame to this dramatic loss. And all of a sudden, in the midst of this Renaissance, there's someone to blame. Guess who it is? Pesky Christians. Oh, it's the church. Oh, it's Henry Williams. It's the missionaries. Ross, characteristically perhaps, was sceptical of the universal beneficence of early missionaries. Ross found that Henry Williams's attitude towards Māori to have been at best paternalistic and at worst condescending. She maintained that as a document, it was based on an element of deceit. No one would question that most of the early missionaries, Protestant and Catholic, were sincere men doing their best for the New Zealanders, often under very tiring conditions. But we must recognise is that their best was not always very good. Their actions were not always wise. Their teaching was not always in the best interest of those they taught. So here is what has been taught for 51 years in every academic institution in this country about the two versions of the treaty. That those two versions have two different words to describe sovereignty. One was mana in 1835, one was kāwanatanga in 1840. And because of that, the explanation for those differences is that Henry Williams was being deceitful. That Henry Williams was trying to trick Māori into signing the treaty so that the Crown could come and take land. It felt so good in 1972 to have an explanation and to have an understanding. Now, what Ruth Ross did is she took 2 words from 2 documents on pieces of paper, and she preached a sermon from words on a piece of paper. And in that sermon, she made a character assassination on a man based on 2 words on a piece of paper. Is she correct? This is, by the way, it's kind of what preachers do every Sunday, right? Like preach from words on a piece of paper, a piece of book, right? Right? What she did was she looked at books and some differences, made an equation what that meant, and said, you know what? It's Henry Williams's fault. He is the cause. He is the crux of the Waitangi problem. It is his woolly-mindedness. And it's had traction ever since. But I have to ask the question, is she correct? And I'm going to show you how I don't think she is. If Henry Williams is a deceitful man, and as I shared with you last week, he was the leading Pākehā in the country. He had the most respect out of our chiefs than anyone, up and down the North Island at least. Remember his walk home, his 2-month walk home from Otaki back to the Bay of Islands? He's going through his meeting. He's just seen the New Zealand Company in action. Ruth Ross made a character assassination on the man. If that is true at such a significant circumstance in his life, over such an important moment in our history, and especially in the history of Māori, then such character flaws would come out in other locations. They would come out in other times, in the 3 decades or plus that he lived in New Zealand and worked amongst our people. So I want to go back to his words and show you some things here. The Treaty of Waitangi, having been declared as the origin of all the existing mischief by which the chiefs had given up their rank, rights, and privileges as chiefs with their lands and their possessions, to meet this growing evil. Okay, would a deceiver call what Governor Grey is trying to do in 1845 a growing evil? Okay, to meet this growing evil, I went down to the warehouse stationery and had 400 copies of the treaty struck off and distributed, and for many days was engaged in explaining the same, showing the chiefs that this treaty was indeed their Magna Carta, whereby their lands, their rights, and their privileges were secured to them. Would someone who deceives and tries to trick people in signing a document, then at his own expense, print off 400 copies? He did this quote was from 1847, but he did this in 1844, and then begin to go around and actually try to explain to the chiefs what the treaty meant in his mind. And what the treaty meant in his mind was it was indeed their Magna Carta, their moment in history which was significant, and he likened it to a moment in English history of 1215 AD, right, when King John was put in line. Right, his dad, Richard the Lionheart, and his and then his grandfather, they had been running their crusades around England and trying to horridly fight over the Holy Land with Islam. It brought so much death, so much so that his dad and his granddad bankrupt England twice in 5 years. And in 1215 AD, the bishops and the barons gathered together and got around King John and said, King John, no more. No longer are you going to be this sovereign dictator over us and our people and over our sons, our daughters and our lands. No longer are you going to have the right to dictate to us and take from us at whim. But guess what, King John? What does the Magna Carta represent? It is the seed moment of the British parliamentary system, where the king, who ruled for centuries and centuries and centuries over his people, where the people stood up and said, guess what, king? You're no longer going to rule like this. You're going to rule like this, in partnership with the representation of the people. Who is the sovereign of England? What is his name? King Charles, right? Who exercises the sovereignty of England? The British Parliament. Within the British parliamentary sovereignty system, there are shared houses of power. Power is shared within the British system already. You cannot have one house operating and functioning in government without the other house. What Henry Williams was saying is that the treaty Te Tiriti o Waitangi was the Magna Carta for the chiefs, where it was not about the Queen ruling like this, but the Queen entering into a kawanatanga, entering into a governance realm with the chiefs. Do you see it there? It's not this, it's this. This is what Henry explains. Sam Carpenter, historian, writes this. He said, it is quite clear from this that Magna Carta for Henry Williams stood for the protection of two distinct types of right. The first was the rights of property. The second was the rank or the authority of the rangatira and its associated privileges. Now, I mentioned at the start a really, really massive book that came out last year by this guy, Ned Fletcher. And I've just pulled a couple of books from his study on the Treaty of Waitangi and his English Empire study on how sovereignty within the English system has been shared houses of power. He writes, in the Colonial Office, Sir James Stephen, remember it was William Wilberforce's nephew, did not treat plurality in government and law as inconsistent with British sovereignty in New Zealand. That's clear from the instructions that he drew up for Lord Normanby and Russell. In 1846, Stephen deprecated interference with Māori custom, writing to Under Secretary Littleton that it had been a mistake not to follow the opinion of Lord John Russell and later Lord Stanley that native customs should be respected and that there should be no attempt to govern Māori in their relations with one another, except to prevent war and inhumane practices. Consistently with this view, the New Zealand Constitution Act, and I mentioned this last week, of 1846, provided for Aboriginal districts within the laws, customs, and usage of Māori, not repugnant to the general principles of humanity, would be maintained for the present. So already post-treaty in New Zealand constitutional law history, the British colonial government actually allowed, according to their understanding of the treaty, realms and provinces and districts of power and authority where Māori lived and had their ownership of their land. It's already been done in our legal history, which our history proves what was being understood at the times in the signing of the treaty, because the English law established it. I want to talk about the founder of the TSB Bank. I quite like to say that, seeing we all live here. Sir George Grey. Apologies if he's your tupuna. It's not your fault. Throughout the history of the treaty, there's been two massive attacks, and not a really cool band from Bristol, by the way. There's been two big attacks on the mana of Henry Williams. The second one was 1972, which we've talked about. The first one was Governor Grey when he came here in 1845. He comes here in 1845, and when he gets here, and he's sent here to assert British sovereignty from this perspective, he asked the question, who do Māori listen to? And of course, he's based up in the north. And unanimously, the word is Henry Williams. And Henry Williams and the CMS, the Church Missionary Society. Governor Grey's first strategy before he stole Taranaki, right? Before he did that, his number one strategy to exert the notion of a full sense of British sovereignty was to destroy the reputation of Henry Williams. Grey writes, Grey was determined to have full authority, and to get this, he saw that a break with the missionary body was essential. Lawrence Rogers writes this in a book called Te Wiramu. Governor Grey accused Henry Williams of treason due to letters written to Kāwati at Ruapekapeka. So Kāwati and Honeheke, two chiefs, Ngāti Kawa, Ngāti Rahiri, Ngāpui, they had built a pā and what do they call, like redoubts, in the Battle of Ruapekapeka. Now Henry Williams, for 2 decades, was a staunch peacemaker. He would, when Hongi Hika was going off and doing his raids, often Henry Williams would sail all the way to Tauranga by him and say, please. He would try to intercede with Hongi. Please, no. Please don't go to war. In other battles, inter-hapu battles, he would go and stand in the middle of them and say, please, please stop. Right? When it came to the Battle of Ruapekapeka, Henry Williams wrote a letter to Kāwati. And in that letter, he asked Kāwati, is there any way that do you have to go to war against the British soldiers, the British Crown, or can we resolve this with peace? Governor Grey intercepted that letter. And in that letter, in that interception, what he told people what the letter contained is that here is evidence that Henry Williams is conspiring with the British enemy, with Kāwati, and therefore he's liable to treason. Okay, and he reports that it was the CMS Māori who was involved in the land wars. He accuses Henry Williams and the Church Missionary Society of large pretend purchases of land. He published the Blood and Treasures Dispatches, a complaint of 24 land claims, 8 of which involved the CMS. I feel myself satisfied that these claims are not based upon substantial justice to the Aborigines or to the large majority of British settlers in this country. Now, missions started in this country in 1814. For the first 2 years, guess how many converts they were? Did I say 2 or 20? Sorry, I was supposed to say 20. For the first 2 decades, 2 converts. One of them was in the Bay of Plenty because the missionary wanted to marry a Māori lady, so she had to convert, blah, blah, blah. Right? It all changed when Henry showed up, and he wasn't into the civilized thing where Māori had to become English to understand the story of Christ. He got it the other way around. He was like, we're in the land of the Māori, we need to learn the Māori language and engage in a Māori way of thinking. Anyway, all that to say is that missionary George Clark wrote in his journal in 1845 an estimation of 64,000 Māori attending church on Sunday. out of a population of 90 to 120,000. So you do the math. Most of our people were going to church on Sunday in the late 1830s, early 1840s. Our people were readers. When the technology of reading was given in the early 1830s, when it came to the signing of the treaty, right, 2,500 English people here, or international people, versus say around about 200,000. And comparatively, there were more Māori readers in the country at the time than there were international people. This rise in our people going was in a large way because of the work of Henry Williams. And Henry Williams was, back in England, I don't want to say he was famous, but people knew who he was because of the amazing work that was happening down here. What Governor Grey did is he took this Blood and Treasures dispatches, and guess what he did? He posted them in English newspapers across England saying that Henry Williams was a traitor. And so England woke up one morning and was like, oh my goodness, this man who we thought was amazing is actually a traitor to our country. And guess what the CMS did? Fired him because of the work of Governor Grey. Now, here's what happened. In 1833, Henry Williams bought 11,000 acres off Ngāpuhi. Now that sounds like a lot, right? 11,000 acres. Why did he buy, and why did Ngāpuhi sell him 11,000 acres? He had 11 children, and he knew that the future of his children was in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so he was trying to provide for the future of his kids. In 1837, the English made a rule in New Zealand that you can only own 2,645 acres of land. Now you're with me on the math. Okay, 1833, 11,000 acres. In 1837, a rule comes, you can only own 2,500 acres. Right? In 1845, Grey comes. Grey looks at this transaction, and Henry's protesting against what Grey's trying to do, and Governor Grey goes, look at Henry Williams. He owns 11,000 acres of land, far above what the British government allowed for. He is a liar and a deceiver. Do not listen to this guy. Now, you can go back to the native land records and you can find what the amount that Henry Williams purchased for that land. That 11,000 acres. When you look at what land was sold at, the pieces of land that were sold in round about the same years, Henry Williams gave money that equated to 22,000 acres. So he was given Ngāpuhi said, you can buy this for this. On his own whim, he doubled it. And it's written in our books and in our history. Now let me ask you a question. Would a deceiver do that? Would a liar do that? Why would Ngāpuhi, why would Ngāti Rahiri and Ngāti Kawa, the two hapu that host Te Ti o Waitangi Marae up at Waitangi, inside Te Ti o Waitangi Marae, why would they carve Henry Williams into the base of their pou tuarongo, inside their marae, if he was a deceiver? So when you walk into a marae and the pou at the very back is the pou tuarongo, the place where peace stands and where all our tupuna rest. Why would Ngāpuhi, why would Ngāti Kawa, Ngāti Rahi, why would they carve a deceiver into the base of their marae where their tupuna rest? if he was a deceiver, why would it be that when he died, hapu who were at war stopped fighting, laid down their weapons and walked to his bedside? Why would they do that? Two attacks on the life of this guy, and over what people have said over his competency to be a faithful human being in his generation. One in 1845, went on for a couple of years, and then of course in 1972, as we've talked about. Again, I quote Sam Carpenter, and there's many quotes in here from Henry Williams. In Williams's explanation to Bishop Selwyn, so Bishop Selwyn, who started this church here, in 1847, of his interpretation of the treaty to Māori. In this letter to the bishop, he rendered part of the treaty's preamble as that the Queen was desirous to protect them in their rights as chiefs and rights of property. Similarly, Williams rendered the Article 2 guarantee of te tino rangatiratanga o rātou whenua, o rātou kāinga me o rātou taonga katoa as their full rights as chiefs. This is Henry Williams's words. Ruth Ross did not go to his words. Together with their rights of possession of their lands and all their other property of every kind and degree. This explanation appeared to make chiefly rights something more than just possession of lands and property. In this 1847 letter, Williams also stated, "My view of the Treaty of Waitangi is as it ever was, that it was the Magna Carta of the Aborigines of New Zealand." On 3 occasions in his life, this is what he stated. This is what it was. He makes it very clear what was going down. Henry Williams understood in what 1835 and what Hare Wakaputanga was. The Declaration of Independence was about our chiefs standing up to the global community and acknowledging that we hold the mana, we hold the sovereignty over these islands. King William was like, "Sure." The US Congress was like, "Kei te pai." There's been an acknowledgement. And from that period, our ships were accepted because we were flying our ensign. In 1835, Henry understood this is what our chiefs were declaring to the globe. And he knew that in 1840, there was no backtrack from that. He wasn't backtracking from saying, "Oh, you know what we did 5 years ago, guys? Oh, well, we're just gonna backtrack from that, and we are gonna put that aside. And now you guys gifted all of that mana to the Queen. You gifted that mana to a 21-year-old girl, right?" No, he knew exactly what kāwanatanga, from a sense of shared sovereignty, meant. That yes, the Queen was going to establish a governorship that took a just rule over these international visitors that were here and out of control at Kororareka, about what the New Zealand company were doing, and it was also going to be a just system for Te Ao Māori, the Māori world as well. Henry's great granddaughter told me that this was the last words that he said on his deathbed, was how cruel, when he understood what had actually happened to Māori through the treaty. In the vaults of Anglican Church history in New Zealand. I've been told by an archbishop that someone recently discovered a final interview with Mary Ann Williams, Henry's wife, and she was asked about the treaty and asked about what the Crown did, and Mary Ann's response was, "We had no idea that so many settlers were going to come. Like, it wasn't even in our imagination that so many would consistently keep coming and coming and coming into the land." Shall we pause for dramatic effect? Should we have a little stand up, eh? Should we have a little break? When you have a little break, if you got some, I can imagine there's many questions in this. Fire them through to the text number. I'll put it back up now. And we'll start again in 5 minutes, okay? What was Henry Williams thinking? Either the narrative for 51 years is that he just made a massive mistake and got the words wrong, which is what people teach, or he knew exactly what he was doing, and he was actually defining very clearly the type of rulership that the Queen was being offered, and that sort of thing. So, mana, we call he wakapuatanga the tuakana, and te tiriti is the taina. So the Declaration of Independence is the older brother, and te tiriti or waitangi is the younger brother. So they're of the same family, but the tuakana has a preference as the elderly brother, because in that it says the sentiment to how our people understand what was stood for and believed in 1835. So Henry was not retreating from that position, but entering into a partnership between the Queen and the rangatira to set up a governing structure that allowed for chiefs to exercise their authority as the British Crown revealed in 1846, and that's what Henry was doing. He wasn't deceiving Māori to give a lower form, hey, you're not giving away your mana, because Ruth Ross argued if he had been consistent and used the word mana, that we give our mana to the Queen, then our people would never have signed it. And she's right. There's no way our people would have signed it if that's what it was, a taking over. And so she said that Henry Williams did that on purpose, used a softened word called kawanatanga to trick our people to signing it. And that's not what Henry did at all. He used the word kawanatanga to say the good faith of how the Queen was going to enter into this agreement with our people. A narrative, as I mentioned last week, had been going on strongly since about 1836, a 4-year discussion of how England relates to Indigenous peoples, where it goes. What I want to do now for the next, say, 20-25 minutes before we close is go through a couple of definitions of co-governance and what that might mean and what that could be, and maybe what it is to some and not to others. First of all, terms like co-governance is like we will make an idol of it, terms of like biculturalism. I just think they all language has its weak points, right? So I just want to acknowledge that, like, it's not a one hit, like it's not a silver bullet, the term in itself. The true terms are what was signed. Tino rangatiratanga, kawanatanga. So, and from a Māori perspective, this new term called co-governance has been put up to try and describe that relationship between rangatiratanga and kāwanatanga. And so essentially what we're trying to do is describe that relationship there. And a term that has been used right now is the term co-governance, for good and for bad. So who's received this in the mail? Who's got them in their bag? I just want to acknowledge these because these are going around our community right now. I read this from cover to cover, and it wasn't until I got to the back cover where the author defined co-governance. So what this booklet is alarm, 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 and then at the end he'll say, oh, here's what we're talking about. And he defines co-governance, and this is his definition. Co-governance is code for the takeover of New Zealand by tribal companies and their representatives, the end of democracy, the installation of apartheid and separatism into everyday life, leading eventually to full-blown government by tribal rule. Okay, so this is a definition of co-governance. Just think to yourself, though, here, where is the co in this definition? Where is the co? It's a false statement. Just to be clear. Co. Together. Joint or jointly. Mutual or mutually co-production. Right? Indicating partnership or equality. Government. Exercise of authority, control. A method or system of government or management. Put the two together. What do you get? A baby, right? no, right, but right, right. Look, if you, look, we are people from Aotearoa, New Zealand. We are the products of our history. I showed a great example last week how you and I have been trained to think about things. We've been trained in that way. Okay? So, if you've been trained in a certain way of thinking, a certain way of understanding the story of New Zealand, that is a story that has the only knowledge of our history might be that Waitangi was signed on the 6th of February and Hononga cut down the flagpole. Right? You might be able to add that in, but if that's the playground and the playing field and the context from which we define meaning, then look, this booklet makes sense. It makes sense from a certain narrative and a certain way of thinking and perceiving. The problem is that the sources and what it's drawing from are the notions. To draw your main argument of the treaty from an English draft version that was discovered in 1989. Wow, like an amazing historical find. But by the own definition in the booklet, it says it was Busby's draft. Is Busby's signature on Te Tiriti o Waitangi? It doesn't matter. It's a draft of an English version that wasn't signed. Ka pai? Now, brace yourself. Just breathe. Just breathe. Big breath in. Big breath out. Just hold yourself as you read this next slide, okay? Hold yourself. Tino rangatiratanga constitutes a collective and inherent authority that justifies Māori claims to Māori models of self-determining autonomy over culture and identity, development of land and resources, improvement in Māori lives and life chances, and a commitment to autonomy in partnership with the Crown. This is Dr. Roger Marker, Ngāti Kahungunu, Ngāi Tahu, writing in his book, The Politics of Indigeneity. A definition of tino rangatiratanga that, I'm going to be honest, I think some of my people forget that last statement. I'm going to be honest. Is that in the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, our people gave something and entered into a relationship with the Crown. Whatever tino rangatiratanga is and what it might be is up to the Māori imagination, and it's up to the Māori imagination to flesh that out in partnership with the democratic Crown. Now, certain people automatically might think that the notion of how Māori leadership might not be democratic, is not democratic, but that's just a notion to what people think. Ka pai? This is a Māori definition of what the notion and the idea of tino rangatira might mean, according to what was embedded in the writings of Henry Williams in Te Tiriti o Waitangi, that our rangatiratanga retain that our chiefs retain our tino, our very and absolute chieftainship over our treasures and lands. Okay, just to put kibosh to the booklet going around our town, okay, let's go to the tribunal. How do they look at the treaty? The Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti o Waitangi. The primary duty of a tribunal charged with interpreting a treaty is to give effect to the expressed intention of the parties. That is their intention as expressed in the words used by them. It is necessary to bear in mind the overall aim and purpose of the treaty. In relation to bilingual treaties, neither text is superior. However, given that almost all Māori signatories sign the Māori text, considerable weight should be given to that version. And I highlight point E here. The contra preferentum rule that in the event of ambiguity, such a provision should be construed against the party which drafted or proposed that provision. In this case, the Crown applies. So contra preferentum is international law on how all governments are to relate to treaties. That if there's any ambiguity, then international law says you go to the version to the parties that didn't draft this thing. Ka pai? Now, I want to give you a couple of examples of there's the macro co-governance from a Crown perspective. there's and then there's the smaller versions, and they are the organisations we work in. They are, in some way, they're even our whānau, our homes. I just want to give a couple of examples. The first one is personal. Who remembers Hong Kong Fooey? Love this guy. Anyway, look, this is just a fun slide to say I was leading an organisation once. And the leaders had come, the 7 leaders or so had come together, and we were running our national meeting, and what we were proposing, we were meeting to plan our national gathering that we had decided to have in Auckland, because the day the hui ended, many of the leaders had to go to Hong Kong for a meeting. See what I did there? And so I knew that our Christchurch leader was coming to convince us to have the hui down in Christchurch, in Otautahi, because they had just built a new building and they wanted to have the whole crew down there to open their new building. And towards the end of the meeting, I said to this guy, okay, bro, you've got 2 minutes to convince us why we should go to Christchurch, to shift our meeting from Auckland. I can tell you right now, it's not going to happen because it's just not practical. And give you 2 minutes. And so he gives us 2 minutes, says this piece, and then we all stop and pause for a brief moment. And then a dear friend, a tūturu Māori friend, who was one of our leaders at the time, he goes, excuse me guys, our brother has a really, really important occasion in his family, that they're opening up a new space, and he wants his wider family to be at this gathering. So it would be correct tikanga if we all go to the opening of this building. Me feeling all deflated, but like, okay, yes, we will shift our national gathering, even though we've bought tickets to this other place and all this, and we will go down there. It was impractical, but it was right. It was right that I had to defer my Pākehā leadership brain at the time to priorities that were important in a tikanga Māori framework, and we had to move to that to bring some life. Second example from an organisation perspective I want to highlight is Te Hāhi Missionary, the New Zealand Anglican Church. In 1984, the Anglican Church proposed the Bicultural Commission on the Treaty of Waitangi within the Anglican Church. And in 1992, the Anglican Church entered into a new constitution, which this woven cross represents, the coming of the 3 tikanga: tikanga Pākehā, tikanga Māori, and tikanga Pacifica. So in 1992, this document and this restructuring of our church takes place. Now, this is important because the first settlement claim was 1995. So the church did some internal look at what was going on with its own movement, and finally allowed for the institution of Te Ao Māori to stand in its own leadership system in its own place. Now, what it says, the report's definition of the principle of partnership was that each cultural group or person is accorded the same dignity in Christ, makes their distinctive contribution to the common life of the church, and each encourages and supports the other. So in 1992, a significant thing happened within the Anglican Church, where it actually took some of what it was understanding at the time and made a change. Now, Dr. Hirenika, Ngāti Porou, Māori minister, has written an amazing book on the history of Te Hahe Mehanari. And in it, he writes this about that time. He says, Mehanari now had almost complete constitutional freedom within the church to give life to their own expression of faith, and it was a great time of celebration and of planning for the future as a truly Māori church. And then he goes on to say this, in reality though, that independence was not what it seemed. A generation of leadership was exhausted from constant struggle and would find it difficult, if not impossible, to break out of a revolution mode into new quote-unquote post-settlement thinking. The 1992 constitutional revision brought only limited resource sharing with it, and the vast majority of minita, Māori ministers, would remain unpaid, working alongside the Pākehā dioceses with their regiments of professional and well-resourced clergy. So today in the Anglican Church, yes, we have given rangatiratanga a leadership. But guess what? Most Māori clergy don't get paid. Still. It's a great question. And this is what Dr. Carr is pointing out. Still today, most Māori clergy are volunteers and work a side hustle to pay for their food. What happened in 1992 was the consensus was, there are 14% Māori in our church. So the decision was divide the resource by 14% according to where the Māori churches are, which are where? Next to marae, out in the countries. So over the process of 30 years, what has happened is that the Māori resource has grown like this, and the Pākehā resource has grown like this, because it's all in our big cities. Now, I'm highlighting that, and forgive me if some of my brethren feel like I'm exposing them, but there's two things going on here. One is the joy of trying to grapple with what does rangatiratanga and kawanatanga look like 30 years ago. And a decision is made. And there's consensus 30 years ago. And there's a way of thinking that makes sense 30 years ago. But then the reality is that what you see is actually the story and the systems of colonisation are still rolling on and still moving and still projecting. So what that means, to be able to say that, means that my leaders are having that discussion. And I say that because my leaders right now know this and are making some pretty awesome changes and are making some significant changes. Now, what this means is that in many areas, the New Zealand government still hasn't actioned in a sense of fullness what, say, a co-governance terms might be like in certain in a macro type of context. But what I find the joy in the story is that the Anglican Church actually has a 30-year history of not what to do. And that's a win if you can see it. Like, it's a win. That if we go, oh my goodness, there's some mistakes that were made there. So let's make some changes for future generations. And that's the play that's going on right now. Okay, what? So first example was sort of my own little leadership Hong Kong Fui thing. Second example, I just want to tell you some of the stuff that's happening within our church. Just so you know here, I am the first dean of a cathedral to be both in the tikanga Pākehā structure and the tikanga Māori structure. So out of the 8, I think there's 8 Anglican cathedrals in the country, this is the first one to actually be brought into the tikanga Māori structure as well. Now, what we've done over the last 18 months is that, sure, the public might know there is an attempt to try and strengthen a historical building out there, but that's just the metaphor. That's just a metaphor of what's really going on, and what's really, really happening underneath of what's happening in this place is that we have instituted a governance structure for Meritapu that has tikanga Pākehā, tikanga Māori, and mana whenua on our governance. And we're asking the big questions about what does that mean and what does that look like. And we're just beginning our journey, but this is what's happening around here. Final example. This week we are in is nothing short of significant. We are lucky to be alive at such a time as this. Te Ruruku Putakirongo. These are the mountain peaks of Taranaki and in the national park, right? Which is currently today Egmont National Park, right? This has been in the hands of the Crown ever since it was confiscated in 1863. So this is the confiscation boundary of what was taken. Just want you to point out here this line. That was the bush line. So this is where the bush went from the top all the way down. So you know our nice little circle bush now? That was a Crown decision to draw a 9k circumference from the top around and keep that bush. But all the rest of the bush went that far out towards the coastline back in 1863. This Friday at Owai Marae, the Crown is gifting the Maunga, not gifting, sorry, that's the wrong word, giving back the Maunga to the 8 iwi of Taranaki. To these 8 iwi that surround the mountain. It's going to be an historical day, an absolute amazing day. And I just want to highlight just 3 simple, quick things. These are just partial things about what's going to happen. The Crown is deeply sorry that its relationship with the tangata whenua of Taranaki has for generations been blighted by the Crown's repeated failures to honour the commitments it made in the Treaty of Waitangi. The Crown is sorry that the promise of partnership that arose in 1840 so quickly became a history of conflict, confiscation and neglect. The Crown profoundly apologises for its confiscation of Taranaki Maunga in 1865. Sorry, I said 63 before. Which severed connections with your ancestral mountain that were ancient and deep. In the decades that followed, the Crown not only failed to recognise your rangatiratanga, but treated it with disdain, refusing to return the mountain, to involve you in its care, or to restore its rightful name. The Crown deeply regrets its many breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi and its principles, and the immense and compounding harm they have inflicted on the whānau hape and iwi of Taranaki. But I say that to highlight this. Through these arrangements, and this is not the Crown, this is being worked out in partnership with iwi and the Crown. Through these arrangements, our maunga will have their own legal identity in their own right. known collectively as Te Kāhui Tupua, not as a mere possession, but as ancestors to be treasured, requiring respect, love, and care. Hence why we have Te Papa Kura o Taranaki as the name of the national park. Te Papa Kura, a treasured, precious place of special significance. Our maunga will be presented by Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi. So a group of 8 people who know and understand them, being the maunga, to be their face and voice. 4 appointed by iwi and 4 appointed by the Minister of Conservation to act in the best interests and for the benefit of Te Kāhui Tupua. This is coming into effect this Friday. This is history in the making in our own land that you and I are a part of. This is an example, an acknowledgement of how a co-governance entity, Te Kāhui Tupua, can look like. A group of 8, 4 chosen by the 8 iwi, 4 chosen by the Minister of Conservation, by the democratically chosen minister, right? This is an operation that is in place now. This is that definition of Dr. Roger Marker in practice, a right of Māori determination and autonomy in partnership with the Crown. What this very moment recognises for us here in Taranaki, and indeed in our country, is a paradigm shift, right? So in 1962, Thomas Kuhn, scientist who people say he stole them off another scientist called Michael Polanyi, but anyway, right? The process of a paradigm shift is that you have a norm, and then hang on a sec, there's an anomaly takes place. Somehow the norm is not working anymore, and that anomaly creates a crisis. And in that moment of crisis and change, the worldview is challenged. And a worldview comes in. The only way a paradigm shift can happen is when an external force hits the object and moves it. Paradigm shifts do not happen within themselves. They don't happen in their own reference points and frameworks, because their own reference work and their own framework is fine and is sorted until the moment comes when it no longer works. Now, I close with this story. When I first turned on to New Zealand history, it was summer of 2008. January 2008, I was listening to a guy talk about, essentially he was talking about the history of Christianity in New Zealand. And at that time, I'd never heard of Te Witi and Tohu. I didn't know they existed. I grew up in a church sort of denomination that taught me that Ratana was a cult leader. And I heard the story of Ratana for the first time. I learned about all of these incredible stories that just blew my mind, and I was amazed and I was angry. It's this funny feeling. I was like amazed at like incredible history that's in this land, and then I was angry that why didn't anyone tell me this stuff? The same week we were learning this history, my partner in crime, partner in life, Erin down the back there, was pregnant with our second child, Indy, who's home sick on the couch right now. Kia ora, Indy. she went and had an afternoon nap. And as she's in bed having an afternoon nap while I was out surfing, she heard in her dream, she sees a really large chicken. A chicken that's 3 stories tall, standing in front of a pahutakawa tree. And the chicken was so big that in her dream she laughed, like, oh my God, there's a big chicken. And then Erin heard the word Huia and woke up. And when I came back from a surf, she said, look, I had this dream and I saw this massive chicken and I heard this word Huia. And now Erin's from the States. And she was like, what's Huia? And anyway, I told her, like, that's a bird that's indigenous to New Zealand, but we've now lost it and it's become extinct. And it was one of those dreams that just remained at the forefront of her mind, and when she said it, just this visual image in your mind of a really large chicken and hearing the word Huia. And anyway, we sat on it for a year. We talked to 3 people about it, and over the course of the year, it slowly began to unfold when a dear friend said this: oh, it's easy. A chicken is not from here. And as soon as he said that, there was this key that began to unlock and unravel. I don't know if you know this, but chickens aren't from Aotearoa. Right? They've come to us from somewhere else. They pick the snot out of each other, which is where we get the term, the pecking order. They have now become an economic commodity, right? They are now the most populated bird in the world. There's more chickens than sparrows. Any guesses why? We eat them, right? KFC, baby. Okay, hands up here. Who grew up in this room having chicken once a year? See that, young people? Half the room would only have chicken at Christmas. Maybe Easter. We have it, 6 days a week? Because it's become an economic commodity. Now, the huia, on the other hand, is a bird that is unique to this landscape. In all of the creation, you would have only ever found it on this landscape alone. Have you ever seen, old photos of chiefs or rangatira leaders kuia with feathers in their hair? Over 90% of the time, those feathers are huia feathers, because the huia feather was the most sacred tohu or emblem that you could give a leader of distinction. Right? They were worn by leaders in the community. Kind of like what a sir and a dame is when you get your medal and all that sort of stuff. Within the Māori world, this is what most tail feathers had between 10 and 12, and within the Māori cosmology, there are 10, some iwi say 10, some iwi say 12, layers to the realms of the heavens, and it was reflected in the huia tail feather. The huia feather was the chief, the leader of all the forest dwellers and all the forest animals. There were the female had the long beak and the male had the short one, and they would hunt together. So the male would break through the soft wood, and then the female would reach in and grab the grubs and throw them out and to feed all the others. These birds are sacred in Te Ao Māori, sacred in our spaces. In 1901, the Duke and Duchess of York came out for a visit, to visit the colonies. They were in Te Arawa, Rotorua, and a kuia, an elderly lady, because the Duke was a chief, gave the chief a feather, and he put the feather in his bowler hat. Journalists took photos of the chief with the bowler hat. Those photos went in newspapers all around the world, and all of a sudden people all around the world wanted Huia feathers. And it took 6 years to hunt the Huia to extinction for the sake of a fashion statement. A bird and an emblem that was the most sacred emblem amongst our people. Chickens aren't wrong. Let me make that clear. They just should not be 3 stories tall. They should not be so large that they are overpowering and overbearing and dominating the landscape. From this dream, we coined this phrase, Huia come home. We are a prophetic people looking for our prophetic tohu. This century, so it requires you and your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandkids. This century is about the Huia coming home and landing again. Not just within Te Ao Māori, but within everyone. It is a dream about the chicken and the Huia being in partnership and not domineering the other. It is a call about that which is indigenous, that which is unique to this landscape and this landscape alone. You will only ever find the Māori way of thinking and the Māori way of being in this landscape. You won't find it anywhere else around the world except for a suburb in Australia or a mine in Western Australia. No, the uniqueness of the Māori world and Māori worldview is embedded in this space. What that means is that the metaphor, the story of the Huia and the chicken represents ways of thinking that have come into this landscape. The Huia is a way of thinking that has always been here. And Taranaki have always been here and married into the migration stories that came here. Just something most people don't know about. But the Huia is a representation of an indigenous way of thinking, indigenous ways of making decisions, indigenous ways of creating together. This is what, if you want to call the term co-governance, if you want to call the term being bicultural, if you want to call it kāwanatanga and rangatiratanga, what it's about is about taking these 2 ways of seeing the world and seeing the reality and putting them together in partnership. I have wanted to frame, I framed this Wānanga series in a ridiculous sense of colour and a ridiculous sense of name, the super awesome origin story of co-governance. Just to say, hey, lighten up, Aotearoa. It's actually not that bad, because you know what it actually is? It is our secret sauce. You know, some of my dear friends in this room here, and parishioners at Meri Tapu, you know, grew up listening to the radio of World War II. You know, gathering around the radio and listening what was going on in the globe. We're in a phase of our globe where, man, it's just so full of animosity. You know, like everywhere. I grew up reading Asterix comics books, right? Which is about a little village in Gaul, you know, that held out against the Roman Empire. This is who Aotearoa is. We're a little village at the end of the earth that has a secret power. And that secret power is that we can take the best of building rockets and marry them with the maramataka. That we can have a rocket lab and we can have a rangimata more, bringing his tupuna wisdom all at the same time. These things are merging in the land at the same time. We can have governance structures like what's about to be instituted here. These things are not to be received with fear. If you put fear on them, that's all you'll only see. The heart of this gathering here and the heart of the next 2 weeks is that we could imagine together. That we could have a sense of an understanding of history, that we are products of ancestors and tupuna who believed in some things, and that we're also we're products of ancestors and tupuna who did some terrible things as well. But we have to understand and know their stories, and we have to shape a better place. And this is emerging in our region, in one of the worst places hit, where all the land, whenever you hear of land wars, 2 days, 2 weeks, maybe 2 months, except for Taranaki. It went on for 21 years. Some say it's still going, right? This is the only place where it went on for so long. But we are the generation of change. We're the generation of becoming listeners. We're the generation of people who are going to do agreeing and disagreeing in love. Where we have to make change. I'm a minister and I'm getting my preach on. So I'm going to stop. And leave the last 10 minutes for some Q&A.
Is this thing on? It's a bit awkward. Oh, here we go. Question time with Uncle Dan and Uncle Jay. Our first one is, we have the UN WEF partnership who through their Agenda 30 Great Reset say they will end property ownership and national sovereignty. Are Māori aware of this, and how relevant will co-governance be then?
There's so much to say to that. That's what firstly, Agenda 30 does not say that. People interpret Agenda 30 like that, as that what they're doing. Secondly, the whole thing is a Eurocentric worldview, and Māori are not Eurocentric. So we will keep being Māori. Like that's a basic answer. From a Māori perspective, we don't care. Sorry, that's probably not quite the right words. If I was Pākehā, how do you tap into a paradigm that's outside the worst things of that? You need to lean into your Māori mates. You need to lean into a paradigm that doesn't subscribe to those world governance notions, for a start. Secondly, in the little bit of research I've done around Agenda 30, if anyone was to read those aspirations, you will add them to your organisation. You will. The aspirations that are in some of those things, they are noble and they're amazing. Now, I gave an example of Anglican Church making a noble decision in 1992 and 30 years of making a mistake off that noble decision. So no matter what the noble ideas are, decisions will be made around it, and we'll make good decisions or bad decisions around it, whatever that is. But what I will say is this, is that the ones who are the first attack on Agenda 30 and those UN notions, which, guess what, they were created to try and, as the first thing to stop climate change over 30 years ago, in the 90s. The first ones to attack it were big business. big business put the research and looked into it and said, you know what, these things about considering what we do with our environment are going to have an effect on us. So big business started to attack it. That says something quite loud to me. I'm not defending Agenda 30 there. I'm just saying, it makes me wonder, because there's some principles within that whole idea that's actually beautiful. We live in a globalized world now. We know our neighbours. We watch what happens in Ukraine. Therefore, we must relate together. And I'm not saying that that notion is the right one. What I hope for is that Māori worldview will have a say about anything of that stuff to do with our landscape. A great example of this is the Kingitanga movement. So when the Kingitanga movement started in the late 1850s and the notion was taken around our country, our principal chiefs, all of them that were asked to become the king, said no, because not one person is supposed to rule over everyone. See how that's inherently built into our people? It says no, because I'm not the king of that landscape. I don't have any authority over that landscape there, and I don't want it. So when the Kingitanga began, our main principal leaders around the country said no one person should have that mana. It's a shared thing. And eventually there was a folding to it a few years later once, funnily enough, Grey began to attack us.
I've been instructed to use the lectern, so here we
So
go.
we can see your face, bro.
There it is. What happens if New Zealand is two separate nations with different laws applying to me and my Māori neighbours?
Oh, look. That's a curly question. It's a what if question, and I'm just so grateful that we have amazing Māori leaders in the spaces who work with government and the Crown, who are just sharp tacks and sharp cookies. But not only are they sharp, they're actually beautiful people, and really have a sense of mana. So you're gonna get the headlines, such and such a person at such and such a beach is doing this, blah blah blah, whatever. That's just always going to happen, right? Whether you're Māori or Pākehā, right? But when you throw it into that space, you're going to hear the worst of the stories. There's a generation of Māori leadership that's been trained for several decades now who understand the ways and the systems of government, and I jumped to a story when Ngāi Tahu actually entered through the settlement, the first iwi to enter into a settlement process, even though Tainui settled before them. But Sir Tipene O'Regan was like, you know what, Crown, we don't want to reciprocate any of the hurt and the damage that's been done to us. So even though our ancestral land is now in private farm ownership, we don't want any of that. Any land that is to be redressed to us is Crown land only, because we don't want to keep, we don't want to reciprocate pain and anger. Now that ways of thinking, like that is in our people. There is a deep sense of aroha. So my experience from what I see of incredible Māori leaders who you don't see on TV, but are actually doing the work. They are phenomenal, just and loving people and leaders. So that's not a fear. That's a reality. That's a fear that might happen in some little instances over some little thing, but it's not going to happen on a grand scale, in my opinion.
Kia ora. Where are we up to? Do you have any comments on David Seymour's use of the term co-government instead of co-governance?
he say that the other day?
Don't follow, David.
Can I say no?
Get back to you.
I'm not sure what that means. Code. Yeah, maybe next question. Yeah.
Okay, next question. Why does democracy not fairly represent Māori?
It's because the you can't make decisions based on what you don't know. And the majority of New Zealand does not know the Māori world. So that's why it represents it unfairly, because it doesn't know it and doesn't enter into that space. It just knows the grand old stories from England that have come in. It just holds the narrative. Yeah. So I don't know if I said this last week, but the weakness of democracy is that it has no memory. It just votes by what is important. But if memory becomes important, not by a vehicle of being a dictator to our past, but by just having, when you row a boat, you ever rowed a boat with one hand? Right, what do? Go around circles, right? But when you row a boat, straightly, even though you're looking backwards at the wake, you're moving forward, right? Like ti tiro wakamua, haere wakamua. No, ti tiro wakamuri, haere wakamua. We look backwards to walk into the future. It's the Māori notion. Yeah, you keep your wake straight. So it blows my mind that people working in government don't know New Zealand history. That's a sham. That needs to be addressed. If you want to become a politician, then you've got to do a history 101 course.
The tables are now turned and Māori are taking power. How do you expect non-Māori to react? It's pure utu, a childish response.
How do you expect? How do you expect? Our people respond as we will respond on Friday. Yeah.
Last one, completely genuine question. How do you tell if someone is Māori?
Not even going to give that any dignity, that question. It's a good book. There's even for references only, and I'm pretty sure you'll be filled with hope if you're into it. Finally, please. There's boxes of this at the back. A speech I gave a couple of years ago that references a lot of the timeline stuff I spoke of last week. Finally, for next week, it's a privilege for us to have some guests into the house. So tell your friends that the next 2 weeks will not be live streamed because we'll have panels and we'll have several presenters, and so we'll be asking them questions, and the live streaming won't work. Just so you know, we will bounce it into the overflow room in the vicarage, however. But next week we've got 3 guests this beautiful man here being one of them, Te Waka McLeod down the back there, and Puna Wano Bryant, who have all been involved in the story of the Māori ward issue here in Taranaki. So they're just going to share some of their journey and their understanding and what that has meant for them and how that's looked for them, and there might even be some great questions from counsellors as well. I don't know. We'll see. If I don't know. So that's next week, and then of course the fourth week we have David McLeod from National, we have Glenn Bennett from Labour, and Debbie Ngārewa from Te Pāti Māori will be here. Now I have framed it to them to say we are not having a political debate. So we're not coming in here to debate politics. We're coming in here to feel the journey between being pragmatic and being visionary, and using our imaginations. And I'm going to allow those guys to speak and to share, and then ask them some questions. Now you've also got the number, so knowing of, well, we're going to talk about Māori wards next week. Then the final week, we're going to talk about the drama of politics and from a Crown perspective. If you have questions that you'd like to ask in those forums as well, just send them through to that number that you've got. Kei te pai. So, e ho mā, what I've desired to do is lay out a history and a story that at some point you can latch onto and get off if you want to as well. But that's what the first 2 weeks has been about, laying some of that history and that story that can help set us up a context. So, nō reira, ka nui te mihi ki a koutou mō tō noho I te wari hononga mō te pō nei. Tēnā koutou. Kia ora.